So afternoon. My name is Hari Prasad, and I'm one of the board members of the Young India Policy Forum. We're an organization that was founded in 2014 to help connect early career and students focusing on India and other South Asia related issues around specifically DC. Today, I'm really happy to have Dr. Nimmi. I'm going to pronounce it wrong because my pronunciation sucks and everything. Nimmi Gowrinathan. Right?
Yeah, close enough. Gowrinathan.
Gowrinathan. Dr. Nimmi Gowrinathan, who is the author of the new book, Radicalizing Her, Why Women Choose Violence, which examines the kind of discourse that we have around female participation in militant groups, and specifically kind of like the simplistic discourses that the Western world kind of promotes. So I'm going to just, without getting too much into it, since I wanted to give away too much of the book, just a little bit about our speaker. Dr. Nimmi Gowrinathan is an activist, writer, and scholar, and founder of the Politics of Sexual Violence Initiative, where she directs at City College of New York. She's also the publisher of Adi magazine and the creator of the Female Fighter series at Guernica magazine. She's also had a lot of her essays been published in Harper's Magazine, Freeman's Journal, Guernica magazine, and Foreign Affairs. And so I'm really excited to have her because one, we don't, especially for YIPF, we don't have often focused on the role of like either gender or also of like these sub-state militant groups, and like how the discourse, both in like the West and even in South Asia to a certain extent, have been reduced a lot, and how like we tend to take a very securitized role towards people who participate in these movements. So I guess I'll start first with a couple of questions for Dr. Gowrinathan, and then anyone else who has questions can join in. That sounds good. So I guess the first thing is, where did the idea for this book come from?
Well, I initially was doing work in Sri Lanka in 2001 during the peace. I was doing like leadership building work in Eastern Sri Lanka, working in what are called children's homes, that are orphanages of girls whose parents had joined the movement most of the time. And I was doing my PhD at the same time at UCLA in political science. And what I was learning about in the formal academic, policy, all of that literature was about why men rebel. And then increasingly, over the summers that I spent, and I would go back every summer, I was meeting all these women who joined the Tigers, right? And it wasn't just the Tigers, for those who don't know, were a guerrilla separatist movement in Sri Lanka that was formed around the 1980s to fight for a separate homeland for the Tamil people. And, there was this disconnect, right, in everything I was hearing and everything, because even the reasons why they joined were not the reasons why the men joined, right? And it wasn't necessarily for me to be able to say, this was in my academic work, for me to be able to say, oh, well, look at women too. But it was to be able to say, by looking at the reasons why women join rebel movements, should actually unearth how you think about why people join rebel movements, right? That the women are offering us some insight into this more broadly. So most of my work, this project as well, starts with a kind of internal discomfort. Now, I don't like the way people are talking about it. It doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't match with how people have experienced life, have experienced violence. And I sort of trace it to that external disconnect. Why is it that we have this? Who's talking about it in what way in the policy world, in the academic world, and other spaces? I chose to make it not an academic book because my interest was much broader in unearthing, using the female fighter to be able to challenge how we see gender in multiple places, and how gender operates, and how we sort of limit the political potential of women. So it was really a question of audience at that point, once I had written the book.
One thing is, when you talk about like this, like kind of discomfort that we have in discussing this, like there's also like, just with the way that discourse is nowadays, is that there's a view that if you like are explaining why people join militant groups in general, whether they're female or male, is like that while you're being an apologist for them, you're being like, you're trying to whitewash what they've done. Like, how do you kind of draw the line between understanding and versus like apologizing for them, I guess.
I think that it's sort of moving all the way backwards to not be put in that position in the first place, you know, because that in itself, the framework of how the white world looks at this is simply in this binary, and you have to either condone or condemn violence, right? But that's your framing of it. That's how you saw it. And so you're asking me to make that choice, right? That's not something I'm willing to do. I don't think I have to do either one, right? And to me, you know, it reveals what your agenda is. I think you were there maybe at one of the sessions in Washington, D.C., where, you know, on the future of women in extremism or something, right? Where you have 3 other speakers from the security studies and the counterterror world and myself. And it's very clear that there's one agenda that wants to see these women as a way as to neutralize a security threat. And there's another that wants to understand and really grapple with political struggle. And the reality is that those two will never find common ground, right? So, you know, the other reason for pushing for unearthing this agenda in the book is that it forces interveners to re-examine their positioning. Like, what's your relevance here? Why, if you decide that you want to condemn violence for women and the Tigers, why should it matter to them? Why does it matter in the reality of their life, right? Violence is simply a reality in the lives of the women that I engage with. It is neither something they think about condoning or condemning. It is a reality. It has always been a reality. So it's also to force interveners who are asking us to make this decision, condemn or condone violence. Why is your opinion relevant? Why should these women consider it? You know, how does it change their struggle?
And talking about the general discourse around female fighters, like especially with the kind of rise of ISIS and like all the talk that came about these female jihadis and like the kind of all these like different narratives, you could go from like the jihadis trend that was published around. Do you feel like the narrative on female fighters has actually gotten worse in the years you've been doing research, or have you seen improvements?
No, I think it's gotten worse. I think the scholarship has always been there. There's been always, you know, a historic amount of very good scholarship coming out of Latin America, coming out of other places. In terms of the public discourse on this, because it entered into public consciousness and into the media most recently through a group that was against Western interests, right? Then you saw the worst possible extremes of the framing of these women enter into the media and therefore sort of capture the imagination of most of the population. I mean, the public discourse for me has always fallen into 2 camps for female fighters. It's either if they're a group that we don't agree with or we don't support the politics of, then they were forced into participation, then they were brainwashed, they were, you know, coerced by some man into participation. If they're a group we do support or the West supports, then they're these kind of sexualized, fetishized anomalies, you know, manicured hands on the AK-47, right? Like, you know, at that time you saw a lot, and you probably still do, like New York Times articles and others that would say, look at the fair-skinned Kurdish women who are fighting ISIS and sexism, right? No, they're fighting for Kurdistan. They have always been fighting for Kurdistan, right? But the framing of it, the way we see these women, became very clearly divided into whether they were a threat to the United States or a threat to the West, or whether they were what we saw as supporting a Western agenda, right? We will, and even then, I will argue, even in the ones that we, you know, want to see as these liberated superwomen or whatever, even then you're not taking the politics seriously by casting them as these kind of, you know, beautiful rebels, right? In that way. So in both ways of framing these women, you don't really grapple with the repression that shapes political identities, it shapes the reasons why they join these movements. Both are a very gendered way of dismissing their participation in rebel movements.
So kind of on that, like when you talk about like how there's kind of like there's both the fetishization of these women or like the demonization of women, depending on like whether it's like in the West interest, but this kind of discourse that we have is, I would say, like it's not just unique to the West, because it seems like it's really common in this war on terror rhetoric where like not just not just the West in general, but like states in general. Like I feel like China has also done similar things. India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, to a certain extent, have adopted similar rhetorics, it seems like. But would you say like this is because like they have their own like little origins in this like rhetoric of how they treat the woman of the like treating the other, or like is it all kind of like stem from the same place?
I mean, for me, the reason the book is written in the way that it is to be able to situate female fighters in a kind of continuum of how limited the political space we offer to women is everywhere in the United States, in India, and Sri Lanka, elsewhere. Now, in each case, in India and Sri Lanka, if you're talking about like at the policy level, right? Policy level, of course, there is a Western-driven narrative, right? The Prevention of Terrorism Act that started here, the language was adopted in Sri Lanka, then adopted in India. You know, of course, the policy language sets that tone. Now, the other thing that's a very powerful force is white feminism in the development world, right? A lot of that language, a lot of those narratives, a lot of the money, and this is really important, a lot of the funding on gender runs through those organizations. So the white feminism that was driving the kind of chickens and cows and sewing machines to save women, right? That then sort of entered into the countering violent extremism space to decide that women who were overtly politicized, like female fighters, should be offered chickens and cows and sewing machines, right? So a lot of the money, a lot of the interventions, a lot of the programming absolutely is anchored in a narrative that starts in the West. But the bigger argument about depoliticizing women is exactly the same in every country. It's just, of course, there are different sort of cultural elements, or different, it maps onto each country differently, right? But this idea, the two things that the book is grappling with, that are attachment to nonviolence and our attachment to what women are capable of politically and what role they play politically, those two things as they intersect with each other, right? They limit conversations in every country, in every cultural context, right? Across the board, we see nonviolent resistance as the only righteous form of resistance, regardless of the level of state violence against nonviolent protesters, as you see in India and Sri Lanka and elsewhere. And across the board, women are allowed to be political insofar as we agree with them, right? If they are democratic, if they are part of the peace process, women are seen to be more peaceful, right? So of course, in different contexts with caste and you know, religious aspects to it, this maps onto countries differently, but it operates in the exact same way.
I think it would be really good to like talk about these kind of depoliticization efforts that you kind of talk about, and how CVE kind of reinforces that. Because I know when I read your pieces in your book, just some of the things of like examples that you use of like what they would have like former Dumble fighters do kind of was really stark. Could you explain that a little bit more, what you mean by that?
I'm sorry, cut out a little bit. They had former what?
Like kind of the examples you used in your book of like how like these programs aimed at depoliticization. Could you explain a little more about that? Go a little more about that, because it's
yeah, the part that draws from the gender and development space. I mean, I've always not supported the kind of, I have a white paper with Dr. Cronin Furman and Rafi Zakaria about, it's called Emissaries of Empowerment, that's about the idea of empowerment itself as a depoliticizing force in a lot of these countries, right? That this idea that one could obtain some form of individual, community, cultural, you know, power by having chickens and cows and sewing machines, which sounds very glib, but it is actually a billion-dollar industry of how we expect to provide power to women. That aspect was then, or that type of programming was borrowed from very heavily in the countering violent extremism. I think it's absurd across the board. But in the case of the female fighter, you're able to draw out the absurdity for an external audience, in that you see this woman who's been, you know, the captain of a battle that captured Elephant Pass or something in Sri Lanka, and is now being offered a pastry cart or a bakery or a sewing machine, or, right? Because fundamentally, both the state and Western donors do not want women to be engaged in political work because it scares them. It's a threat, right? To the state, it's a threat to the status quo. Nobody will fund overtly political work, right? Even if you're talking about, you know, the big guys, the big gender donors out there. So the two really sort of borrow and reinforce each other, but the impact of it is that they are depoliticizing women, right? And the other sort of layer to that is, that's in Emissaries of Empowerment in the book as well, is this casting of women as sexualized victims, right? The majority of the way that we enter into the gender space is by looking at early marriage, looking at sexual violence, looking at child trafficking, right? Everything that casts brown women in particular, brown and Black women, as sexualized objects, right? The problem with that, of looking at a woman as a sexualized victim only and seeing her only through that sort of one-dimensional lens, is that you never expect political action from a sexualized victim. You won't, right? You don't see this person as a political actor, right? And so now you suddenly neutralized a huge amount of the population who might otherwise be considering or be interested in participating in overtly political resistance, right? So there's sort of multiple things operating at the same time. There's of course the colonial element to it as well, but fundamentally, yes, both development and counter-violent extremism programs are geared towards depoliticizing women.
This is the thing. If anyone has questions, if they want to type in the chat or just send it to me, and I'll call on you to do it because I have a couple more questions. And for anyone who wants to do it right now, go ahead. I know Sylvia has a question, so I'll give it to her in a sec. But there's like one example when I first saw you talk about in DC was was the example of like how like there's like this rhetoric of culture, rhetoric of culture in the. My question, Dawn's like, this is what causing the real problem of like, and you used the example of like how this like family wasn't sending their girls to school, and people. And I know because I remember this stuck with me. It's like, oh, but people kept on saying like, it's because of the culture, it's because of the culture. But then when you talk to them, it was actually not because of that. I mean, the guy might have been, but was like the primary reason was like it wasn't safe for her, wasn't safe for the girls to go, and it was hard to be kidnapped. And I guess like kind of like one thing that's a really consistent theme is like this idea of like how kind of like with the demonization of women, it's like all these like they're fighting against their culture and dealing with this. I guess would you? Sorry, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the culture, anyone who comes from a South Asian culture knows that patriarchy is a problem, right? The question is whether you're highlighting patriarchy in order to deflect from a bigger political agenda that you're interested in, right? So the problem with culture to me is that it's a very useful perpetrator because it holds nobody accountable. First of all, when it's said, particularly in white institutions or in Western spaces, it's said as this sort of static, inherent thing. Culture is tradition. Culture is weighted. It can't be changed, right? Culture is not static. Culture revolves around context. People adapt to their environment, to war, right? Culture shifts constantly. But second of all, it's very useful for you to use because what you're able to do then is say, well, this is not the government's fault. This is not state's fault. This is not NGOs, nobody's accountable. This is just culture. It's the way that it is, right? But the reality is when you say something like, well, there's an increase in domestic violence in the Tamil community after the war, which is cultural. Yeah, or it's because the military opened a bunch of liquor shops inside refugee camps. Men were not allowed to work. They couldn't leave the refugee camps. And so there was a rise in domestic violence, right? So to cast these things as cultural becomes very useful. This is not to say, again, not being forced into a binary, it's not to say that patriarchy and culture is not an issue, but it's not something that the UN is going to change. I see that fight happening. I see it happening amongst young Tamil women, young Tamil queer folks, that fight is happening internally all the time. We are always fighting back against our culture, forcing it to change, forcing us to accept us in lots of different forms, right? But that is not the role of outsiders, right? And so analytically, to keep placing culture as central to how an intervention can or cannot be successful is a misplaced analysis, but also, again, it allows for other agendas to take hold, right? Because you can say, oh, well, these men are beating their wives, so we need the military to be there, right? Even though the goal of the military being there is to occupy land that doesn't belong to you. But this is why the military is there, right? So it's, again, you'll be sort of forced into, so culture is not a problem. Of course, there's a problem. There's the patriarchy in culture. But it's being able to sort of just reveal the ways. And I think that's what a lot of the book, and I hope a lot of my work does, is to constantly just sort of reveal this and say, we know that this is what you're doing, right? And that this is affecting policy, and it's affecting intervention, it's affecting funding. We're just putting it out there that we're aware of this is what you're doing, what you're using culture for.
Sylvie, you said you had a question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Hari. Nimmi, first of all, thank you so much for sparing your time to speak with us. I think like what I heard, it's just fascinating. As a nuclear policy analyst and someone who thinks a lot about the importance of expanding the role of women and gender in nuclear weapons decision making and policy making, I just thought like a lot of your remarks really reveal on the other side of what we are talking about. Like over here on the nuclear weapons policy making side, we're talking about like the importance of having a diverse and a more focus on gender to have better outcomes in decision making. And like it was just really amazing to hear from you on like looking at like women and gender like in the battlefield field through a more like holistic lens. So before this call, when I was looking at your books, and it just seemed to me very fascinating that it was mentioned that you had spoken to a number of women soldiers from Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and also Latin America. So and you've also mentioned in your remarks that you try to have a more the lens from a global south perspective. So what were some of the major themes that did run concurrent, not only from your conversations of from with women in South Asia, like women soldiers in South Asia, but also Latin America, and what are some of the comparative parallels that maybe we can draw from them?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I should clarify here that I've never worked with soldiers in Pakistan. This is something that I think that gets missed in the Western publishing, gets picked up, and people assume that I'm talking about Pakistan. I've only worked in Sri Lanka, Eritrea, Colombia, and a little bit in Mexico. But in the Sri Lanka and Colombia, you know, I think on the first part of what you were talking about, the work that you're involved in, you know, I've done a lot of work in, particularly in 2009, in peace talks, and other dialogues, you know, and the frustrating thing for me is that, again, when you use this language of diversity, right, it's a particular type of diversity, right? But you can't get to more effective results by saying, okay, we're going to have 2 women, or we're going to have 2 queer people, or we're going to have 2 Muslims. You can only get to a kind of addressing the root struggles of violence by having a diversity of perspectives, right? So maybe you have a woman there who's a hardcore nationalist, and maybe you have a Muslim there who is, I don't know, supports a separate state, and one who supports a government, right? But these kinds of superficial identities, again, is part of the problem with this, because when women are included in these conversations, and I've been there, you know, in all of these like peace talks and dialogues, whatever, it's as if the back of their seat has already been marked, you know, like that they are the ones who support democracy and they support peace, and that's why they're there, right? But you cannot actually get to, there's so many women who have supported violence that you can't have peace talks without considering the women who have supported violence, you know? And I think that the biggest similarity was probably the FARC and the Tigers, and it sort of operates on multiple levels. One is, and it's a question I think Harry had too, about transnational solidarity, right? At that time, you don't see it as much now, but at that time, you know, when I went to the FARC in Colombia and I said the Tigers, everybody knew the Tigers, right? Everybody knew who they were because they learned from each other. The Tigers and the Eritreans were working together. The Tigers and the Palestinians were working together. Right? Well, there's some back and forth there, but with other struggles, there was a kind of natural process of learning, of engaging, of solidarity that happened, right? One of the women I interviewed in London, who was central to the movement, would describe to me that they would, in the 80s, they would all sit on the floor and they would eat Tamil food, and the Eritreans would come and Libyans would come, and it was like one family. And they would do political education classes, right? And it's one of my bigger concerns is that I feel that we've lost that. We don't have that ability, right? In that way. So on that level of political struggle, there was ties, like actual ties between these organizations. They were reading the literature from each other. They were reading poetry that happened across each other, right? There was a lot of poetry coming out of the battlefield in Colombia, in Sri Lanka, in Peru, and other places, right? They were sharing those things. On the other side, the way that they were treated was almost exactly the same. I mean, it was 10 years later in Colombia when they did the peace talks after Sri Lanka. And I swear to God, it was like watching history. I was there the day they signed the peace talks. It was the exact same thing. The women were on one side segregated in Cuba to talking about gender, right? And on the other side, there was a conversation about agriculture, about planning on urban planning, all that kind of stuff, which the female fighters who I knew were very much involved in deciding where the agricultural plotting was going to go, but they were stuck on the other side in the gender conversation, right? And if this is what happened in Sri Lanka too, people will say that, peace talks fell apart or the Tamils were not willing to. But when the women came together, what I heard repeatedly was that they wanted to talk about domestic violence. Okay, but the Tamils wanted to talk about militarization. We want you to get the soldiers. Our primary concern is get the soldiers off of our land. I don't want to talk about domestic violence, right? Maybe that's your issue in the South, but we need to talk about militarization first, right? So again, when the frame is set for gender as a siloed subject, then alongside that, you have the issues that women should and can be concerned with. Those will always be ineffective dialogues. I mean, of course, Colombia followed the path that most people expected. So I think on sort of an optimistic and a pessimistic level, like at the pessimistic level, you sort of watch it repeat itself over and over again, the interventions and the framings and all of that, right? And then on the other level, at the level of solidarity, it is kind of beautiful to hear the histories and how intertwined these struggles were naturally in ways that you never hear anymore.
So then kind of on that, because like on this of like how there was like this kind of solidarity, especially and like a lot of the groups that you focus on in like Sri Lanka, Eritrea, and Colombia were like, in a sense, they were fighting against state repression. They were fighting against both like a patriarchal society norms expected on them, as well as like the repression of the state. But like especially now, like I think there's been kind of more attention, like in India, like there's a lot of women part of the Hindutva groups who argue for like a much more stronger state to repress other minorities, and like there's the rise of the alt-right, and there's all the people who like kind of like, I don't want to say it's quite like feminism in a way that they're trying to do this, where like they're like trying to redefine like these groups that they're in to like say like we're going to take away rights from other folks, and like I feel like in some ways that kind of takes away from like one like a kind of universal struggle of like, okay, like if we all want like rights and freedom and like the ability to do it, like how do we kind of navigate that where there are like seems to be like a lot more rise of groups for people who are arguing for more oppressive forces and more things like that.
It's always been a difficult position for me, but if I'm going to live by my politics, right, I'm put in a position then when I can't condone or condemn, right, the actions that these women have taken, whether or not they are politically repressive or not. I can have my own political perspective, but I was researching a piece on white nationalist women, and it was very difficult for me because I felt like, okay, I have to take their politics seriously, right, because that's what I believe should happen. But I also don't want to platform their politics, right? So it's a very, very kind of difficult space to navigate, but I maintain that to not take the politics of women seriously when they're stated as clearly as they are, right, is not only dangerous, it's anti-feminist. It is, right? So someone like Aung San Suu Kyi or Darling of Peace and all of these other things, right, who fit perfectly the model of what the West wanted. She was democracy, she was peace, she was nonviolence, she was all those things, right? She herself asked us to take her seriously as a politician, but we weren't able to do that, right? We weren't able to see that she had strands of Buddhist nationalism in her, right? Strands of violence. Maybe she never carried a gun, but obviously she was not anti-violence in terms of politics, right? And I think you have to take that seriously. I think for me, the important part that I landed on in this essay that's in the LA Review of Books about the white nationalist women was to point out the different ways in which they're framed, right? Because the reality is that those women, the right-wing women, particularly now with the rise of these regimes, have the protection of the state. So they're not described in the same ways that brown women are, that resisting women are, right? So to point out the fact that when I read about these white nationalist women, I heard every detail of their lives. And one of them had gotten divorced, and one of them went through a goth phase, and one of them felt isolated or anxious. All of this to justify why they were part of a violent white nationalist movement, right? Whereas if you, and you know, some of them were much closer to arms than any of the brown women I know who have been detained, who have been arrested, right? Who are offered none of this nuance at all. You know, when it enters into, and I've done a number of asylum cases and a number of, you know, where I have to go into a defense of her marriage in order to, you know, everything is placed on, well, she must have been convinced by a man, she must have whatever. There's absolutely no life history. There's no nothing. Not the fact that she watched her father's head be blown off at a military checkpoint. That doesn't justify why she maybe supported these movements, right? But this woman had a bad divorce, and it's okay that she's a white nationalist, right? So it's not so much as not recognizing the politics on both sides. I think that women make choices, their lives shape them, and they join particular political movements. It's about then being able to see the difference in the support and the protection they're offered. None of these white nationalist women who have overtly espoused that they want to bring harm to other communities have been arrested, have been examined by the FBI. I mean, this is publicly in a book that's out there. Nobody, right? So it is, you know, one just have to say that, yes, you take the politics of women seriously, but you have to look at the ones who are protected, and it's always a particular political agenda, the one that allies with the state, that are protected, right? And they're described in a very different way than the ones who are anti-state or non-state actors.
Then kind of also on that, because since you, especially because you do interview a lot of women who are like anti-state or resisting against the state. And like even like when I went to I visited Sri Lanka for the first time a year ago, well before COVID happened, and I went up to Jaffna to try to meet some people, and when I was like trying to say like, oh, can I meet women with the Tamil community? There's like, you gotta be careful because this happened after the ISIS attack, and you know you could be kicked out, and like a lot of like places in general are like very skeptical of when you go like interview people who are involved in like resistance movements or anti-state movements, especially as someone who's done this and does it all over the world. Like, how do you kind of navigate that danger of like, there's a possibility you might not be even allowed back into the country, or how do you even keep people safe? This is more of, I guess, a methodological fieldwork question.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll always be okay, and that's important to recognize, because you have that privilege, right? You have, I'm a U.S. citizen. In the end, I'm probably protected, right? Maybe there's the off chance that something happens, but it is much more a question of the subjects that you speak to. So there was times that I wouldn't meet with women. I wouldn't talk to women. There's other times that, you know, you really have to read the situation. There's times that, you know, that I talk about in the book, that people sort of thought about what's the best way for her to get into this church, you know, where they were keeping the victims or women who were raped by the state, who were pregnant, so that it was visible they'd been raped by soldiers and all of that. And, you know, we thought maybe she could go with an NGO, and somebody said you can go with an NGO. Someone said maybe you can, you know, drop off supplies. And then in the end, it was very interesting. My son was with me at the time, and he was 9 months old, and they said, no, just have her carry the baby. And so most of my access actually comes from playing on the very gender stereotypes that I am critiquing, you know, because you're seen as soft, you're seen as, with the baby, I was suddenly not a threat, right? So I took the baby with me, and we went into the church and spoke to women, and, you know, so, but central to me always is the women whose lives are being affected by this, who really are in danger. And so in the book, for those of you who haven't read it, there's 2 or 3 central characters that I focus on. The reason that I did that was because I knew I'd be able to stay in touch with them. And that's very difficult in this research, because I lose touch with so many women through the course of violence, through the course of, you know, natural disaster. You know, a lot of them have died on the battlefield. But I knew that these women I'd be able to stay in touch with, so I was able to get those parts of the book translated and given back to them first before I published it. You know, which is it's not a guarantee of anything, but at least I knew they had read everything, that they were okay with everything, that how it was described, and they wanted to take that risk, right? Rather than writing 15 different stories of women who may not have been ready to take that risk.
So, and you touched upon this a little bit already, and it's based on one of the questions I sent you about transnational solidarity is like, there's always been a kind of the role of the state, especially like a state that sometimes will support these movements out of its own selfish interests. And while there's always been that kind of that dividing factors, which like, well, like you don't want to say anything bad. Sometimes you don't want to say anything bad about the state that supports you, especially if they're the only ones providing support when everybody else in the state and the other state is against you. Like at least sometimes it feels like, especially like when I'm just going on social media, whether it be like looking at conflicts within South Asia, that like I guess like the presence of the state and like the divisiveness of the state has become like a much more stronger factor at times. Like, do you see any way like to like fix this, or like how to like get back to the roots of like kind of creating this transnational solidarity between causes and people?
I think that it's very contentious. Of course, there have been debates inside the community about the role of India, and people who support, want to support in the different aspects of India, the role of Tamil Nadu, the role of others. There's been a lot of debate around what the connection between the Tamils and Palestine should be and the state of Palestine. I think that there's no easy answers to these conversations, because at a certain moment, one has to make strategic decisions, right? And the Tigers made strategic alliances with certain governments who maybe they didn't support the general politics of, right? But it was kind of a politics of desperation at that point, right? When you're making those kinds of alliances. I think now we have the opportunity to have a much more thoughtful conversation inside the community about what it looks like to find political through lines in the struggle, how to identify anti-Blackness, how to, all of those things can be had inside the community. But to me, what's really central is to not allow that to become a way to divide the struggle. And unfortunately, you see that too often, right? You'll see two people who disagree on like the role of India, and the struggle certainly fractures, right? Or who disagree on the role of the alliance to Palestine, and the struggle will fracture, right? And that to me is the fundamental goal of the state, right? So to be able to have those conversations in opposition to these forces who you're already the smaller movement, right? You can't fracture any smaller, or you're not going to get anywhere. Right? And so that, it is a really important thing. It's not easy. It's a very difficult conversation. I think it's more difficult now than it was in the past. I think the role of kind of narrow identity politics has made it very difficult to cross some of these boundaries. And it's something that I worry about, particularly for the next generation of activists.
And I guess this might be my final question, unless anyone else has any questions. It's kind of because you mentioned this event that happened at DC with the GW program on extremism.
Yeah.
Because I remember being there for that, where it was where you kind of saying like a lot of some of the things you're saying now, of like how we have to take it seriously and like talk about the militarization, and then you're followed by a policymaker who's saying like, oh, we need to find more ways to like have people call police in some place or wherever that, especially because like where even today, like I can't see like the conversation in DC or other capitals being so differently, where like the whole idea is like securitization. How do we like get police there? How do we get intelligence agents there? Like, I guess like kind of going to like more policy things, like how do you think like we should be differing in our approach of that, like how to think of a solution? Because you've talked about like here's a kind of problem with the narrative and stuff like that, and how we need to embrace a woman as a whole, like women's and their politics as a whole. How do we go, I guess, in actually implementing that and taking it seriously?
I think it'll be different for everybody, in terms of the risk you're willing to take. The reality is that going up against these institutions is, a very risky thing for your career, right? They don't want people who point out race. They don't want people who point out, and so there's, ways that you can do it that are less risky, but there's ways that at least for yourself, you can start to build a consciousness, of what's happening. And I think that particularly for the younger people I've worked with, sometimes you're at the stage where you just develop the consciousness yourself, and you sort of input what's happening in these meetings, these conversations, into a new framework in your head, where you're sort of keeping note of the fact that this is not just not correct. I mean, for me, and again, for each of us, the discomfort is going to be different. The discomfort always comes from something that does not relate to how people experience violence. Right? When I see that disconnect, that's where the discomfort comes, right? In that conversation that you were talking about, when I wrote in the book, I think about this, where there was a woman who worked for FBI or something and said, well, the women who come back from Syria, there's a there's a craving for their creature comforts. That's why they come back. You know, first in my head, I'm like, so you just compare this woman to a creature. Is that what you just said? And then she said, you know, when I pushed her on a little bit, she said, you know, like having a glass of wine at the end of the night and watching your favorite sitcom. And I was so struck by the absolute kind of complete, it's not, I don't think you can even call it a disconnect. It's like different planes of comparing a Syrian refugee to having a glass of wine with a sitcom at the end of the night, you know, like that frame of reference. And the fact that this woman is actually developing policy for the FBI, you know, and you're right, the securitization will always be, you know, there was a counterterror expert from Romania, I remember once, who said, well, you know, when we go to Disneyland in Paris, they search me, they search my wife, they don't search my 4-year-old daughter. Why don't they search my 4-year-old daughter? Again, you're comparing Disneyland in Paris to, and these are your solutions that you should keep, you know, obviously it's been shown over and over again that militarizing checkpoints leads to increased vulnerability to women, it leads to increased sexual violence, which then leads to increased recruitment into militant organizations, right? So all of these solutions are not only ineffective, but they circle back into pushing recruitment into militant organizations. And so that to me, like, you know, I'm in a position as an independent scholar, as someone who's in a privately funded space, a research, you know, institute, where nothing's going to happen to me. I can say what I want to, I can write what I want to. But I know for a fact that most women of color who are inside institutions, who, and I was in them, I was in the UN, I worked for the crisis group, I, you know, worked for all of them. You don't have the ability to say that, right? It's the reason that I left. You don't have the ability to write what you want to write. So the most you can do at that stage is to sort of in your head and somewhere write down the ways in which this is really, really problematic. And hopefully one day you find the freedom and the space to be able to write and think without as much risk as you have inside an institution.
Awesome. And
Hari, if I may just ask one last question. You know, Nimmi, in your remarks, you often spoke about the next generation. You often indicated that these are some of the concerns I have about like the scholarship that's upcoming. So I want to know from you that what is the one takeaway from your book you like you would like to flag for the next generation? What is that one guiding thought that you would, I know like everyone can have and take away their own different thoughts, but what is that one thought that you would like the next generation scholars on terrorism, counterterrorism studies to take away? And allied to that question is in a way I think like a pitch for the book. Why should folks outside the terrorism, counterterrorism orbit read this book? And yeah, I'll stop there.
I think the book was written, you know, when they asked me, the audience in publishing, as they like to do, it's not a very appealing audience for publishers, but it's for young activists. It's for young women of color. And, you know, the idea that, well, you know, they're not who buys books, I don't think that's true. I've seen my students at City College, you know, work late night shifts at a restaurant to be able to buy books. It's for two reasons that the book was written, or for one main reason was written for them, is that I got the sense that, you know, a lot of the activism happening, a lot of the political work, you know, social media lives, it was very flimsy. You know, it was like someone had an opinion and they suddenly erected a political platform online, which could easily be collapsed, but it was also very divisive, right? They weren't able to find any kind of solidarity, right? And so I hope, my biggest hope for the book is that it pushes young people to go deeper into your own identity, right? To find the through lines with other struggles, and to know that it's not just you out there, right? That it's not that you come from a history of struggle, right? And there's those of us who are, even when you feel alone in a meeting full of all white men, which you will, right? That the rest of us are standing there with you. And so when you inform yourself that we're out there, that we've been there, that we're reading and thinking alongside you, you feel less lonely. And, you know, ideally you don't feel crazy, right? My hope is for young women, particularly young women of color, to not feel crazy when they hear something and they're like, that's really fucked up, you know? But what I don't want is for them to take that emotion, that immediate response, and post it publicly. What I want you to do is to sit with that and marry that sort of emotional reaction with critical thinking. That's where insight comes from, right? And I think there's a little bit of difficulty with being patient there, right? And also to understand that what has become a very individualized way of social activism, the branding of activists, is antithetical to what we should be doing, which is a collective struggle, right? Each of these women that I document in the book are not concerned with themselves, right? Even the way that the publisher wanted the book framed around me was something that I had to resist because it's part of a collective. It is not one woman, you know? And so it's difficult work. It's not terribly glamorous work. You know, you're not going to get a lot of fame off of it, but it is the political work that needs to be done, right? And I just want them, I felt like everything was sort of flimsy, and to be able to have something to grasp onto, right? I mean, I was doing these talks with other activists, and there was all this kind of rah-rah revolutionary, like, yeah, we can do it, and women can whatever. And it's like, there's 500 women who showed up to Columbia Law School on Saturday morning at 8 o'clock. They know they can do it. I don't think they need us to be cheerleaders. I think they need something to hold on to build their politics on top of, to build their own platforms, you know? And so, yeah, my wildest imagination and deepest hopes, I think, is that that's what this book is something for them to build their own political project on top of.
Awesome. I keep saying awesome. So unless there's anybody else who have a question, I think we can wrap it up about 10 minutes early. So that'd be
Yeah,
nice.
and if any of you are in DC, I think I will be at Bus Boys and Poets on September 8th.
Oh, which location, you know, or?
Nope. But I'll post it. I'll send it to you. All right,
sounds good. And I'll be sure to forward it to our mailing list. So,
yeah.
And do check out the book. Do check out the book, and also Bus Boys and Poets is like one of my favorite restaurants in DC, and they have amazing food
Cool.
too. So
yeah, I think it'll be a good conversation.
Awesome. I'm gonna stop the recording right now.